Good evening, and welcome to this evening's debate on Measure C in Los Altos. My name is Mike Kasperzak, and I will be the host and moderator of this evening's debate. For those of you who are wondering, I am a former council member and mayor in the city of Mountain View, and I will be acting as a representative from Switzerland for tonight's debate, since we don't have any dog in this fight. I'm joined this evening by four individuals who will be taking the pro and con sides on the measure. With us for the Yes on Measure C campaign are Anita Enander, who is a Los Altos Council candidate and a former planning commissioner. We also have Ron Packard, a former council member and mayor of the city of Los Altos. On the No on Measure C side, we have Cathy Lazarus, who used to be is a retired public administrator from Santa Clara County and was the Public Works Director for the city of Mountain View. And we have Bill Sheppard, who is a technology consultant and former Los Altos Bike and Pedestrian Advisory Committee member or commissioner. So tonight's format is going to be a little different than forums you may have seen. It is going to be roughly in the form of a true debate. Those of you who might be fans of Intelligence Squared on NPR may not find this totally like an Intelligence Squared debate, but we are going to go in the format where we have constructive arguments, and each side will be given an opportunity to give two constructive arguments. And then following all four of those, we will have rebuttal arguments. And so the proposition that we have before us this evening is Measure C, which will be on the November 6th ballot. It reads, shall an amendment to the City of Los Altos General Plan be adopted requiring voter approval of the sale, lease, or certain changes in use of certain land designated as parks, other open space, or public and institutional in the city's general plan. So with that, I think we will begin, and we will begin with the first affirmative constructive argument, and that will be presented by Anita.
Thank you, Mike. Good evening. Measure C is simple. If the City Council wants to convert certain public land to private use, they need to get a vote of the residents. It covers our parks. It covers our civic center, which contains the ball fields and orchards that people think are parks, but are not legally considered parks under our general plan. It covers the downtown parking plazas and other city-owned land that is considered public and institutional under the general plan. Why do this? Citizens who have been involved in prior efforts to stop the change of use of Rosita Park, Mackenzie Park, Village Park, and Hillview could see that such pressure would continue and even increase. They were completely forward-looking. They began to talk almost 2 years ago, shortly after similar measures were on the ballot in Milpitas, Santa Clara, and Sunnyvale. Those city councils had finally succumbed to pressure to try to sell or lease public land for private use, and their citizens decided they needed to protect their lands for the future. The Los Altos residents knew that just because they had fended off the loss of public land in the past was no guarantee that would continue into the future. They chose an initiative amendment to the general plan because it is more permanent than a city council action that can be reversed by a later council. The council is trying to do just that, by the way, pass a temporary measure that can be reversed at any time, but they can't fool us. Measure C provides a more permanent, proactive process before we lose any precious public land. The proponents of Measure C have gone to great lengths to publish and publicize the actual language of the measure, to make it clear how straightforward it really is. Opponents claim it is confusing, but offer nothing to support that claim. Opponents claim it will cause many votes on leases. This is nonsense. It does not affect the changes or renewals of any current leases or operating agreements, as long as the properties remain in public use, as they all are now. Opponents claim that any notable changes to operating agreements for the libraries and fire stations would require a vote. That is electioneering nonsense too. You don't need to be a land use attorney or even a non-practicing attorney to understand that our libraries are public and that our fire stations serve the public. The operating agreements for both are with public agencies. I'm frankly astonished that so many of our former mayors can't seem to understand this simple concept. So the opponents next claim that it is somehow undemocratic. Yet the residents had to vote under state law on the council's proposal for a $65 million bond in 2015. That election, which cost over $300,000 to hold, went down to defeat by more than 71%. Our democratic processes require that bond measures and tax increases must have public votes, and those are temporary. The development of public land for private purposes is likely to be permanent. The land covered by Measure C is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. No wonder private interests want to get their hands on our land. And it is certainly easier to pressure 3 council members than the whole community. Ask yourself, do you trust the politicians and the influence of special development interests to make decisions that convert public land to private use? Or do you trust yourself and your neighbors to do what is best for our land and our city? Thank you.
Thank you, Anita, and right on time. We'll now move to the first negative constructive argument, and that will be presented by Cathy Lazarus.
Thank you, Mike. I oppose Measure C, along with the League of Women Voters, 10 former mayors, the American Association of University Women, the Los Altos Chamber of Commerce, the Los Altos School District, County Assessor Larry Stone, the Mercury News, the Palo Alto Daily Post, and many, many good citizens of Los Altos. I think we all agree that parks and public open space should not be sold, and I don't think there's any disagreement on that. And if this were a straightforward measure, none of us would be here because we would all be supportive of that particular concept. When you sell public land, it's a one-time infusion of cash that does not help cities with ongoing delivery of public services and facilities, which is one of the bigger challenges cities face in California. The fatal problem with Measure C is that it's an overreach when it tries to regulate leases. It falls into confusion regarding what is included and what is not. What are the appropriate definitions of public use? What are the appropriate definitions of public purpose? Is it a senior center? Is it a child care facility? And what constitutes a restatement of leases that may be subject to a vote? It is not simple as the proponents cite. The city attorney has already indicated some weaknesses in its language. And if it was simple language, we would not be having this convoluted conversation about what's included and what is not. Approving leases by ballot box is not sound government, and causing the city to incur the cost of elections uses scarce resources that are better used for senior and youth programs and improving infrastructure maintenance. Most importantly, Measure C flies in the face of our representative democracy. We elect people to City Council who share our values to work with professional staff, study the issues, and make public policy decisions on our behalf after broad civic engagement and open and transparent public processes. Measure C assumes the public will have the interest and time to study the nuances of leases and possible land use descriptions. To quote the League of Women Voters who oppose the measure, the League believes in representative government and holding our elected officials accountable. Initiatives should be clear, unambiguous, and limited to a single subject. They should contain a sunset clause and allow for changes to meet future city needs and challenges. Measure C meets none of these tests of good governance. Also significant is the misrepresentation of the proponents as to what this measure was about. It was originally marketed to members of the community, including myself, as Save Our Parks, which is a great idea. It said nothing about leases. In addition, there seems to be confusion about what the meaning of many of the provisions are. For example, when a kind neighbor approached me regarding to support Measure C, I asked the question, what is magic about triggering an election for a lease of 7,000 square feet or 180 days to cause an election? And again, she had no idea why these were sacrosanct and why these would trigger an election. So I encourage voters to study Measure C, to make their assessment, but ultimately to vote no on this measure. Thank you.
Thank you, Cathy. We'll now move to the second affirmative constructive argument, and that will be presented by Ron Packard. Ron?
Thank you. Good evening. In the last couple of months, I was approached by two prior Los Altos mayors to join a group of other prior mayors in opposition to Measure C. I could not do so because I had not yet completed an analysis of the measure itself. I have now done that and come to the following conclusions. One, the opposition is premised on a false conclusion regarding the scope of Measure C. The wording in the finding C5 states that the initiative applies only to actions that would significantly impact the public character of lands owned by the city and that would effectively privatize the land. Because this is not repeated in the policy statements, the opposition wants them ignored. But that approach has been condemned by our California Supreme Court, which has consistently ruled that an initiative must be interpreted, quote, in light of the initiative as a whole, including uncodified statements of purpose and intent, close quote. Now, taking into account the other sections of the measure, as we must, does a renewal of a lease for the fire station cause a substantial change in the public character of and privatize that land? The public use is the same before and after. The same with the library, the same before and after. The same with the school use of the storage of the city's yard on Fremont Avenue. The same with all the other leases. The opposition's entire house of cards is premised on this false interpretation of the initiative by reading only the first three policy statements and ignoring everything else, a practice condemned by our California Supreme Court. Now, number two, if the concern is real, there's a simple solution. The city can add a complementary policy to the general plan consistent with the other portions of the initiative. By so doing, any opponent would have only 90 days to file a lawsuit, and any further litigation would be barred. Now, the concerns about the city council dipping into city land is not imaginary. Let me read to you from the downtown vision plan that was just adopted by our city council. The city's operating surplus has been committed, and it does not currently have funding for this level of downtown improvement. However, the city does own an 18-acre campus at Civic Center. Depending upon the level of development intensity permitted, the real estate value of this campus could be worth $200 to $350 million. Replacement of facilities such as a new library and city hall would need to come out of that value. However, should the city wish to fully capitalize on this real estate asset with a public-private development approach, it is likely that sufficient funds could be available for the improvement of downtown. Number four, what are these downtown improvements? Putting developments on 8 of the 10 parking plazas with offices, food court, another boutique hotel that they say is to be 3 or more stories high, low-cost housing, etc. These improvements, in my opinion, would result in a significant loss of the downtown charm of our village and the parking shortage worse than downtown Palo Alto. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. And we'll move to the final constructive argument, and that will be presented by Bill Sheppard.
Thank you. The Measure C was initially presented as Protect Our Parks. Most of us on the opponent side can agree that it would more effectively or more accurately have been titled Stop the Downtown Vision. All of us can agree that the parks should be protected. They have been protected. Never in Los Altos' 66-year civic history has a bit of parkland ever been sold or leased in perpetuity, and we have acquired parkland during that time. The concerns are that this is no way to craft legislation. So a law has been proposed by the proponents of Measure C that is poorly written, even by the proponents' own statements, it could have been written better. And the result is a measure that can only be fixed or remedied by another proposition. So it would be a very expensive and timely, and in the meantime, we would suffer the consequences, many of them unknown or unintended. We are told that the language is simple, yet the city staff in their extensive report have said many parts are unclear and it leaves uncertainty as to what a significant change is. In fact, the city would have to draft the language regarding what is a significant change, and if citizens don't agree with that language, then they may come forward with suits and further tie up how the measure is interpreted and add great costs in the form of litigation. There are many costs associated with Measure C. Special elections or regularly scheduled elections are both expensive. Regularly scheduled elections typically cost $50,000 according to our city staff. Special elections typically cost, or have the last special election for Measure A cost about $350,000. The regular elections are held every 2 years. So if we can't resolve an issue within a 1 to 2 year time frame, no developer is going to be willing to move forward with a proposal in Los Altos because of this uncertainty and cost associated with that. Other cities have tried these sorts of proposals, but none of them are comparable to what's being proposed here. The proposals in Santa Clara and Milpitas were strictly about parks and open space, not public and institutional land. And the proposals in Los Altos Hills and Milpitas didn't include leases, which are really the big issue here. So the concern about leases, I understand that the proponents feel that leases are clearly not at issue because if there's not a significant change to the use of the land, it doesn't count. I agree that the library, the fire station are very unlikely to be put to an election of the people. But we have a new community center under construction, and it's likely that a cafe may want to be on that land. If that cafe is not viewed as being exactly how the land was used before, and that's certainly a reasonable interpretation, then any resident could come forward and say an election is required, which greatly complicates how this will happen and who may sign the lease. Bottom line is, putting aside all these details, the endorsements for Measure C are clear. From many credible industry groups, community groups such as the League of Women Voters, as well as the major media in the area, including the San Jose Mercury News and the Palo Alto Daily Post, have unanimously said no on Measure C. The proponents have not yet offered any endorsements from civic groups or from media that are in favor of Measure C. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. So much like you see in your ballot statements, and you should all have received your ballot statements from the state, I don't think we've gotten them yet from the county, you will always see an argument and a rebuttal. We are now going to enter the rebuttal stage of our debate here, and we will begin with Cathy giving the first negative rebuttal to Anita's original argument. So, Cathy, and the time now is 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mike. I want to emphasize that the City of Los Altos has never sold parkland. In fact, the city continues to acquire parkland, most recently Lincoln Park from the county several years ago. Yes, there have been proposals that potentially would have affected city parkland, but all of those have failed, with the councils endorsing the sanctity, of our public facilities. The question of bond measures and public votes, yes, they do cost money. And as a former president of the League of Women Voters, the two general elections are of the lesser cost. Special elections are the ones that are the most significant in terms of cost, up to $400,000. If there is a public-private proposal that should come forth in the future, no developer or private sector person is going to wait for an election in order to proceed or invest in our community. I think the reality is that there is no problem that exists in Los Altos today, and Measure C is trying to solve problems that don't really exist within our community. The downtown vision is exactly that. It's an idea Now the hard work comes for the city to develop the implementation strategies and the funding mechanisms to replace parking and prioritize the public amenities desired by the community in that vision. That will take a long time. What the council member just read is from a consultant report. The city needs to do a little work and figure out what its priorities are. By no stretch of the imagination should one assume that those projects will come to fruition anytime soon within our lifetime. The vision is a 30-year horizon, and I'm sad to say that many of us will not be around when it is fully implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. And now we will move to Anita, who will give the first affirmative rebuttal to what was Kathy's constructive statement.
Thank you
Anita?
very much. This measure is about the future. It's not about the past. The Lincoln Park acquisition actually started about 10 years ago. I'm very happy to hear our opponents acknowledge that if this was about parks, maybe we wouldn't even be here. But the truth of the matter is that the other cities passed measures about parks because that's what their city councils were going to sell or lease. The Measure C proponents never hid that public land was covered. It was openly discussed and described to anyone who waited to hear about it, specifically because it covered the ball fields at Hillview that most people think are parks, as an example. No problem with the future? No problem with our public and institutional land? I think what Mr. Packard read a moment ago from the Downtown Visioning document clearly says what the intention of this council is. I sat in a meeting about 2 years ago with Mayor Mordeau and 2 other people, and we were at City Hall. He waved outside at the orchard and he said, "That's useless, a waste," and proposed that we should have a 5 to 7 story building there as a way to make money for the city. I think that's a problem. I think that if the city wants to make that magnitude of change to our town, we, the citizens, have a right to vote on it. Because Measure C takes a decision for disposing of public land for private use out of the hands of special interests and puts it in the hands of the smart people of this town, it is opposed by a lot of folks. It's opposed by the people who have special interests and pet causes. I prefer to trust you, the residents, and your neighbors to do what is best for our land and our city. Why don't the politicians?
Thank you, Anita. And now we will go to Bill Sheppard for his rebuttal.
The opponents to Measure C talk about the downtown vision plan and the likelihood that it could create great change downtown. This doesn't happen in any sort of short time frame. Today we have 8 parking plazas, concrete, there are trees, it makes for easy parking, but there are many, many improvements which the people of Los Altos overwhelmingly support. Surveys done within the last year by the city show that 83% would like to see a more vibrant downtown, and over 60% would be in favor of using the parking plazas appropriately for other amenities, which might include 3-story buildings with some housing or with some retail, perhaps a theater for the bus barn, perhaps other amenities like that. So when we talk about what do the residents support, the residents seem to support a vision that includes evolving Los Altos forward. Downtown is not healthy today. There's too many empty storefronts. Even vibrant businesses are leaving at times. And without bringing people downtown and increasing the amenities, we can't solve this problem. Measure C is simply the wrong way to solve this. It's no way to craft legislation. Every good governance guideline says you do not put these minute details in front of the people to vote. It makes no sense to expect our citizens to understand the details of how a lease works with a cafe or with some other entity, maybe even a bike share plaza that would be put someplace. The details of having everyone understand that is not best left to the broad population. In conclusion, I think the editorial in the Mercury News was very clear. Los Altos voters should soundly reject Measure C, the poorly written, unnecessary attempt purportedly to preserve the city's parkland and open spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And last but not least, Ron Packard will give the final rebuttal argument.
Thank you. So the people are not informed enough to vote on these matters, and we should rely on public representation. And yet, just a couple years ago, the City Council and many of the former mayors that are now opposed to Measure C, and a lot of the private property owners, downtown owners that are politically active, were all in support of Measure A. And it went down in flames with 71% of the voters voting against it. And this is the same group that we want to rely on in determining how to deal with the up to $500 million of public land that Mayor Mardeau sees as a piggy bank to do pet projects in downtown. I'm opposed to that. Now, the signature collection. This was done by private residents volunteering their time. They used a sheet that I looked at, and it said, "Protect our parks and public lands." There was no intent to say it was limited to parks, particularly since many of the sports fields that appear to be parks are not so zoned. In terms of surveys, the survey also says that the #1 reason why people move to Los Altos is school systems. #2 is a small town atmosphere. That small town atmosphere would be destroyed by many of the proposals being made by this City Council, some of which are deemed to be in the short run, not the long run. So I would recommend Measure C was well thought out. I'm not recommending how to vote on it, but don't buy many of the excuses and arguments that the opposition make. We have politicians who want to protect their own turf. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. And that concludes the actual debate. Now, in a typical debate, we would have judges that would decide which side has won and lost. The judges this evening and on November 6th will be you, the voters of Los Altos. Ballots, I believe, will start coming next week. You can vote by mail if you are a vote by mail resident. We encourage you to do that, and we encourage you to vote if you're not voting by mail on November 6th. The results of this debate will come out at about 8 p.m. on Tuesday, November 6th, when the election is over. So first, I would like to thank all of you, Ron, Anita, Cathy, and Bill, for being here to represent faithfully your sides of this debate. I would also like to thank KMVT and their entire staff for having us here and filming and broadcasting this. I would also like to thank our sponsor, the Los Altos Community Foundation, and I will say that I have the honor of chairing both of those organizations. And I would like to thank our producer, Larry Barron. And with that, thank you all, and good night.